The Allies invaded Italy in September 1943. The dictator Mussolini was thrown out, and Italy soon joined the Allied side. Then began the long, tough campaign up the spine of that unfortunate country. This volume, covering late 1943 and early 1944, shows the preparations for further action. In the Pacific, American forces seized Bougainville, the Gilberts, Tarawa, and Macon, each providing a base closer to Japan. In Europe, the big three, Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union, agreed to invade France in the spring of 1944, and General Eisenhower was named to command the invasion. The enterprise was codenamed Overlord.
The enemy had come far and fast, reaching out to conquer a world. But his blitzkrieg offensives were a thing of the past. The United States Army was by now very much in the war. With combat-experienced divisions in North Africa, the jungle-covered islands of the Pacific, the Aleutians where they had wiped out the Japanese on Attu. Now the blooded veterans of the North African campaign had landed on Sicily in a drive for the Italian mainland. Millions more were training in the United States. We were well on the road to the ultimate victory.
Our drive across Sicily was aimed at the key port of Messina, just across the narrow straits which separate Sicily from the toe of the Italian mainland. The Germans fought stubbornly, utilizing every defensive advantage offered by the rugged terrain. Italian forces offered little resistance. Patton's 7th American Army attacked from one side, while General Montgomery's 8th British Army pressed forward from the other. Citizen soldier G.I. Joe had fought and defeated the best the Nazi had to offer in North Africa and had taken the enemy's measure. Now he was a veteran who had growing confidence in himself and in his leadership. He was a soldier. Whether he knew it or not, he was adding new glory to the traditions of the American fighting man. And at war's outcome, the word defeat had never been written on the scrolls of that fine tradition. In many areas, there was nothing more than a rut or a road. So units of the 7th Army did a little amphibious leapfrogging along the coast in their push for Messina. While our 7th Army pushed the Nazis across Sicily, in faraway New Guinea, the 503rd Parachute Infantry Regiment made an airdrop at Nadzab, while American and Australian ground forces continued to press forward. Our growing air power made a daylight raid on military objectives in the heart of Italy. with 500 bombers. On Sicily's north coast, Patton's 7th captured Palermo and drove on eastward toward Messina. In the air, 177 American B-24 bombers raided the oil refineries at Ploesti in Romania with 300 tons of explosives. The initiative no longer belonged to the Nazi fascist Axis, in the air or on the ground. The ruthless drive for world conquest had been stopped all the way around the earth, from North Africa to the Pacific, where U.S. Army troops and Marines captured the Munda airfield on the island of New Georgia. On the same day our troops took Munda, Soviet forces smashed German defenses in central Russia. Key military targets on the Italian mainland were being mauled by our Air Force. Our ground forces were also hitting the enemy with devastating power. The crushing defeat suffered by the Axis in North Africa and Patton's advance toward the Straits of Messina were psychological poison to a badly shaken fascist regime. The once triumphant Caesar God, who had looked like this at the height of his power, when his fascist legions had slaughtered and conquered Ethiopian tribesmen who fought with spears and ancient guns, now looked like this. Mussolini had led his people through a nightmare of military disasters. His arrogant dictatorship had come to an end. Retributive justice was close at hand. The King of Italy ordered Marshal Pietro Badoglio to organize a new government and conduct secret negotiations for surrender. A separate peace by Italy was the last thing Hitler wanted. The collapse of Mussolini and his fascist regime brought additional German forces pouring into Italy. From fighting ally, the Nazi was now the unwelcome intruder who would wage his battles of fierce resistance on Italian soil, bringing further ruin and suffering to an exhausted and war-sick people. On the 17th of August, 1943, 38 days after the invasion began, Patton's 7th Army took Messina, and all Sicily was in Allied hands. As well as 100,000 Italian prisoners. Most of the Nazis had escaped to the mainland across the Straits of Messina. "11 days after the fall of Sicily, Allied headquarters in the Pacific announced the end of all Japanese resistance on New Georgia Island. General MacArthur's forces were starting on the road back. We had already begun our island hopping in the Central Solomons. But the battle for Nazi-held Italy was only beginning. On the 3rd of September, 2 British divisions crossed the Straits of Messina to land on the toe of the Italian boot. Six days later, American forces struck the beach at Salerno, 30 miles south of Naples. They met stiff enemy resistance. Four days after the landings, the hurriedly reinforced enemy launched a strong counterattack, pouring in some of its best troops. For a time, our foothold was precarious. But supported by a concentration of combined firepower from aircraft, naval guns, and artillery, the Allies held the beachhead. The heavy pounding by land, sea, and air was too much for the Nazis. They fell back as our own forces pushed on toward Naples. By then, Italy had surrendered unconditionally, was officially out of the war. October 1st, 1943, elements of General Mark Clark's Fifth Army entered the city of Naples. They were greeted not as conquerors, but as liberators. The citizens of Naples knew that we and our allies were the only hope of driving the Germans from their homeland. Here, as elsewhere, a new problem confronted our invasion forces: how to provide government for the civilian population. Years of fascism had promised plenty, but delivered only strife and hunger. Unless such centers of hungry population along a route of advance are well controlled, the advance is hampered. Communications break down, supply channels clog up. In Naples, the Allies met the challenge and thwarted chaos. The Naples water supply presented another challenge to the Allied forces. This problem was also mastered. Military government was a necessity, one which also had a direct influence on post-war rehabilitation throughout Europe. Following the fall of Naples, we expected our advance to continue. It did, but only for a brief period. The mountainous regions of central Italy provided the Germans with a number of natural defense lines. These, together with the closing in of the Italian winter, virtually stopped our forces in their tracks, scarcely 80 miles from Rome. While our fighting men in Italy were faced with a veritable stalemate, an entirely different kind of war was going on in the faraway Pacific, where Allied forces landed on Mono and Sterling Islands in a campaign launched to drive the Japanese from Bougainville. We invaded the Gilbert Islands. The 2nd Marine Division took Tarawa after 76 hours of bloody fighting. Heavy casualties were suffered. But the Japanese were wiped out. Elements of the Army's 27th Infantry Division took Macon and the neighboring atoll. Our Army Air Corps was engaged in massive bombing of the industrial heart of Germany, devastating Nazi plants and marshalling yards. But the Nazis' Götterdämmerung, the twilight of the gods, had yet to come. The bitterest of large-scale battles had yet to be fought, and some of these were soon to come on the Italian front, where strong defensive positions were held by a tough and stubborn enemy. That and the weather had bogged down our advance. It was winter 1943. The stage was set for the Cairo-Tehran talks. Roosevelt and Churchill met with Chiang Kai-shek at Cairo. Even at the moment fighting was most intense in Italy, high-level master plans continued to be made for the invasion of France and for other Allied operations throughout the world. At Cairo, talks centered on the relation of European operations to the war in the Pacific. From Cairo, Roosevelt and Churchill flew to Tehran, where for the first time during the war, they met with Marshal Stalin, dictator of Soviet Russia. The Allied leaders failed to agree on everything, but one thing they did agree upon was that the invasion of Normandy in southern France must and would take place sometime during the following summer of 1944. For some time, there had been doubt as to who would command Overlord, the invasion of Normandy. Roosevelt, en route home from Tehran, stopped off at Tunis to see General Eisenhower and to tell him that he was to command Overlord. The grand design for victory in Europe was now completed. But so far as the Allies in Italy were concerned, France and the cross-channel invasion were a long way off. It was to be a tragically long winter of hard fighting in Italy. There was the battle for Monte Cassino. To bypass the mountainous terrain holding up our advance in southern Italy, our forces made an amphibious landing at Anzio, only 35 miles south of Rome. Heavy Nazi resistance stalled the breakout from the beaches. Finally, we blasted our way out of the pocket. The landings at Anzio convinced Hitler that we were launching an all-out campaign in Italy. He rushed 8 more divisions to reinforce his army in Italy, and the stalemate was resumed.
This video will emphasize the all-important bombing of the European continent in support of D-Day, June 6th. It will show American 4-engine B-24 Liberators and P-38 Lightning fighters striking the critical oil refineries at Ploesti, Romania. We will fly with the B-17 Flying Fortresses of the 8th Air Force as they hit the ball bearing factories in Schweinfurt and the Messerschmitt fighter plane plant in Regensburg. The stage is now set for D-Day, probably the most critical single event of this century.
Dawn, August 17th, 1943, England. On the first anniversary of their operations against Fortress Europe, the 8th Bomber Command prepared 376 B-17s for the 2 most critical targets on their list, the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt and the Messerschmitt aircraft factory at Regensburg, both deep in Germany.
What an anniversary. Just a year ago, we flew that first mission to Rouen. 12 B-17s flying 56 miles to target. Now we were taking 376 fortresses 500 miles into Germany. Never had we prepared for so rough a mission. In 1943, the AAF was still growing up. The Luftwaffe had already reached its peak. But our boys taking their battle folders knew it. By the time we turned in our personal stuff, it was well understood that the projected doubleheader would bring on a large-scale and costly air battle. In chapels all over England, most of the men turned to their ministers, rabbis, or priests. Getting into the trucks, we didn't dream that August 17th was being written into air history. Not only because of us, there were other soldiers in the skies. This was the same day that Sicily fell to the Allies. The same day that the RAF bombed Peenemünde, the V-2 rocket plant. The same day that General Kenny's B-25s destroyed 200 Jap planes at Wewak in 8 minutes. And this day, our double mission involved the deepest penetration ever attempted into Germany, and the largest bomber force to be dispatched to date. We knew that as we went further into Germany, we'd hurt her more. But we also knew we'd have to pay a higher price for admission. And now the last briefing as the pilots rechecked the details of the mission with their crews. Individuals no longer existed. We were now 10-man teams, and on our teamwork would depend our success and perhaps our lives. Action against Schweinfurt got underway. The Regensburg task forces had just hit their target. A vast and intricate machine of destruction had been set in motion. Behind these modern warriors were weeks of high command planning. Now crewmen took care of routine duties. Ahead of us were 4 hours of rugged action. Our guns were going to be especially important today. At the briefing, they told us we'd have help from short-range fighters and 8th Air Support mediums. The fighters were supposed to take us about halfway. The mediums were to bomb diversionary targets. But for the worst part of the trip, we'd be on our own. Finally, after a few hours delay due to bad weather, 2,300 men counted the seconds.
So far, American bombers had never been stopped. Although German defenses had stiffened, American formations had not been prevented from reaching their objectives once they responded to the green takeoff signal. As always, each thundering run was an epic of suspense until 30 tons of bombs, plane, and men were lifted from the earth. The leader of the first wing, Colonel William Gross, swept in a huge circle around the field. Gradually, the second and third bombers edged into position. The sky quickly filled with stately fortresses sliding through space. But as soon as they got into formation over the British fields, they were picked up by German radar. Across the channel, the tentacles of the enemy's locator system, having touched the flying fortresses, now pinpointed them in space. Luftwaffe experts accurately plotted the American course, altitude, and speed, and promptly informed their fighter control. Immediately at dozens of Nazi aerodromes from as far north as Denmark to down around Paris, German fighter units began to send up everything they had. Their order was, intercept and destroy the oncoming fortresses. The answer to the increasing Allied bomber offensive was this stepped-up German fighter strength. Waves of opposition screamed off the map of Europe.
In spite of the Luftwaffe, Allied planners selected our targets according to Allied Air Force priorities. That's why, merely 3 hours after the 4th Bomb Wing had paralyzed the Nazis' Messerschmitt factory at Regensburg, we in the 1st Bomb Wing were on our way to strike Schweinfurt in the face of an aroused enemy. As we began to run into flak, our gunners could feel the entire German Air Force warming up. Flying in enemy territory, we felt like goldfish in a bowl, waiting for the attack. Strict radio silence was maintained, while trained eyes searched the sky.
Unleashed every trick. The B-17 suffered the most savage blows since the war began.
Although Jerry knocked 20 bombers out of the sky on the road to Schweinfurt, we never broke formation. Despite the ferocity of the attack, which extended all the way to and from the target, we pressed forward. Our guns kept burning the enemy out of the sky. Approaching the bomb run began the most critical defensive period. Now we divided into smaller groups, sacrificing our mutual defensive firepower to bomb the target most efficiently. The crucial moment. The moment around which the entire mission revolved was now in the steady hands of our bombardiers. Each bomber was now committed. No more evasive action until bombs away. At this time, The formations were most vulnerable to attack. It didn't matter. We had a job to do on Schweinfurt. We had 400 tons of high explosives to deliver. After getting 80 hits on the two main ball-bearing plants, we could defend ourselves again, at least to the extent of evasive action against flak and fighter attack. But the main idea now is to get home fast.
At the British landing fields, word on the sky battle was out. Red flares were expected. That meant wounded aboard. These planes had priority in landing. Many of the fortresses themselves were crippled. A few came in with feathered props or with knocked-out landing gear. After struggling home at housetop altitude, one B-17 with wounded aboard was committed to a crash landing. The name of the ship was My Prayer.
The anniversary battles lost us more men and aircraft in a single day than the 8th Bomber Command had lost in our first 6 months of operations over Europe. We who carried the war 500 miles to the enemy's industrial heart knew better than anyone how expensive it was. We had lost 60 bombers and their crews.
What happened this 17th day of August, year 1943, was a testament to American men with modern weapons and a very old idea, fighting for freedom. On this day, high-altitude bombers engaged in their greatest and, from the point of view of loss, their most disastrous air battle to date. Nonetheless, the results justified the price we paid. March 1944, Italy. 7 months after surrendering to the Allies, Italian airfields resounded with growing American air might. From rebuilt Axis bases, the Allies were able to attack Nazi targets beyond the working range of bombers based in England. Out of the many sky battles, Allied air forces had gradually achieved air superiority. Now, theater air commanders, Generals Spaatz and Aker, arrived at Foggia to plan new strategy with General Nathan Twining, the 15th Air Force CG. Spaatz and Aker were handing Twining the biggest job his bombers had ever undertaken. The 15th Air Force soon got the news. They had been ordered to fly through Hitler's back door and destroy his oil industry. General Twining and his staff took on the job.
Gentlemen, we have just received a new directive establishing target priorities for the bomber offensive of the 15th Air Force. The decision has been announced. We will destroy oil refineries and synthetic oil plants. Now, Colonel Young, what does our intelligence show us in regard to these targets within our area?
More than 50% of the refineries and synthetic plants producing gasoline for the Axis are within range of the 15th Air Force. Between 25 and 30% of the total Axis production of gasoline is represented by the 10 large refineries around Ploesti. While these refineries were seriously damaged in the attack last August by the task force operating from Egypt, recent photo reconnaissance reveals that, with one exception, all refineries units are currently operating at full capacity. Gentlemen, you've heard the problem. It's a big job we've got ahead of us. The knockout of Ploesti means the German will be deprived of 1/3 of his oil resources.
We bomber boys who moved up from Africa started the Ploesti air siege. On the morning of April 5th, 94, B-17 swung into formation. Close by were 136 B-24s. We were strong. We expected the enemy's coastal radar network in Albania and Yugoslavia to spot us as we made our approach over the Adriatic Sea. Although it was still early in our 600-mile run to target, we got into flak suits. They're a kind of insurance. Climbing to altitude, we skimmed the Yugoslav mountains. Mighty peaceful. Peaceful until they bristled with flak guns. We were soon to find out the hard way that Ploesti had become the third best defended spot on the continent. This was a high-altitude mission, 21 to 24,000 feet. As we neared the target, we edged into tighter formations. Each had top cover. We all remembered a 1943 Ploesti mission with 177 liberators in which we lost 54 planes. Would this be like last year's mission? This one might be worse. 250 enemy fighters, outnumbering ours 3 to 1, attacked. Fighters almost had enough. By the time we crossed the Sofia-Belgrade line, our lightnings moved in for the knockout punch. Then we ran into flak. 256 heavy guns filled the sky with black, deadly mushrooms. Intense flak, the enemy had added smoke. We could almost smell the nauseating acid fog. 2,000 smoke pots effectively covered Ploesti. Accurate visual bombing was impossible.
At headquarters, they knew something had to be done. After many missions, the target was still effectively protected. On 10 June, operations decided on a new tactic.
We're going to dive bomb Romano Americano tomorrow using P-38.
For 4 hours, 1,200 miles, we buzzed the Balkans. The smoke screen had to be lit. We climbed to bombing altitude, and some of us dumped our wing tanks as we got close to the enemy. refineries, we attacked German fighter units on the ground. Our P-38s got through the smoke. The mission was successful. We had destroyed 29 enemy planes and had damaged 3 refineries.
But the job wasn't done. Operations increased. Servicing went around the clock. The plan called for the bombers to be on target during the morning hours and stop Ploesti's working day. Now they prepared for 600-plane missions. They tried new electronic devices for blind bombing. Everyone hoped the sheer concentrated weight of tonnage would crack German and Romanian defenses. Ploesti sort of got under everyone's skin. After hitting it from the air, the flyers rehashed it on the ground. The men ate it, slept it, cursed it, especially the flak and smoke. The 4-month campaign since April had cost 1,900 men, the crews of 189 bombers and 41 fighters.
Early in August, General Twining called a meeting of our group commanders.
I've called you in today to discuss future air operations against Ploesti oil refineries. This strategical air force, during the next 3 days, will attack continuously, night and day, with maximum effort against all refineries in the area.
We got over Ploesti all right, but the enemy gave us a warm welcome. They rammed up more than 45,000 rounds of flak. That didn't stop us. During 3 days of smoky air siege, we lost 30 more planes, 23 to flak. But now we had over 100 Mustangs as escorts. The enemy jabbed and our 51 swooped into the battle. Hit hard, enemy fighter strength fell apart. Displaying courage far beyond the call of duty, our boys drove the enemy into the ground. Flak kept our bomber crews on their toes. We waded through it all the way to the target. The full weight of our attack fell on Ploesti. That did it.
The steady pounding whittled away 90% of Romanian oil production. The global and greedy designs of an Axis dictator were consumed in a blazing, oily Ploesti. This was the crowning climax to our air siege. In only 5 months, this had become the graveyard for 1/3 of Hitler's oil. Oil, a pre-war weak point in the Nazi military supply system, became a bottleneck under repeated Allied blows. The bombs had crushed gasoline producing, storage, and shipping centers. Vainly, Germany's 350,000 slave workers tried to repair the damage. But now all the refineries in the rich Ploesti cluster were damaged or knocked out.
We hurt them, but they hurt us too. The Ploesti campaign had cost us 270 heavy bombers, 49 fighters and their crews. Each plane and each man helped to shorten the war. As we hit the donut line, we were still flying the mission, and we wondered about our missing air crews. How many would come back? The answer came sooner than we had expected. 12 days after the last bombing of Ploesti, we got a real thrill. An airlift of 56 transport-converted B-17s were bringing back our buddies who had been forced down. Romania had surrendered to the Russians. In just 3 days, more than 1,100 returned as part of Operation Reunion. This was the first mass prisoners of war liberation. Of the first 600, only 10 were stretcher cases. All in all, considering what they'd been through, they were a light-hearted bunch. It was good to be back. Yes, it was a day to remember, that day at Foggia Airport. These were the first, and General Twining made it plain how glad he was to have his men back. He had planned something special. From his Coral Sea experience, he remembered what privation meant. First, he gave his men medical care and food. Then, Godspeed on their next mission. Their new checkpoint was the Statue of Liberty. Their target was home.
The 15th Air Force, by burning Ploesti off the target list, did more than merely destroy enemy oil production. They brought eventual disaster at compounded interest. The German war machine was stalled for lack of fuel.